Is war on the horizon in the Southern Caribbean? Vast amounts of U.S. military power has been moved into the vicinity of Venezuela. Strikes in the Caribbean have already occurred. Is this the start of something much larger? There have been many explanations as to why this is happening. From stated goals of eliminating narco-terrorists to theories about trying to get Venezuela's resources and the old classic, regime change for the sake of regime change. While all or none of this might be true, there is, I believe, another interest, which is actually quite simple and pretty obvious. What we are looking at is also a shaping operation in preparation for a potential World War III. I hesitated making this video because I actually think this conclusion is kind of too obvious. Yet, when I spent time looking for others saying what I will say here, I simply could not find them. This isn't in the regular news sources, mainstream or otherwise. I only found something kind of similar in pro-Chinese propaganda, so maybe that's kind of saying something. Now, some think tanks have in the past and recently postulated that the goal of removing the Venezuelan regime would be good for the United States. In doing so, the United States would make a kind of fortress Western Hemisphere, controlling its own backyard, or as some have put it, the Dunroe Doctrine. But backing up my claim is actually a clear articulation by Southcom's Commander Admiral Halsey in his official written statement to Congress from February, and that I will present later. But most analysis seems to be looking only at the surface level. What I believe is happening here is a geopolitical shaping operation to secure the Western Hemisphere, and especially the Atlantic Ocean, in preparation for a major conflict with China. I didn't want to do a clickbait title, but there was really no avoiding it with this material. Because what do I mean by World War III? By World War III, I mean a potential conflict that includes multiple theaters around the globe and multiple powerful actors, namely the US, Europe, and its allies versus China, Russia, Iran, and their allies. Here, I'm putting the spotlight on one major potential ally, Venezuela, the topic of this video, who, depending on the outcome of these current tensions, may or may not take part in that war. And whether it takes part or not would have major ramifications in how that war would play out. Simply put, Venezuela is the most belligerent opponent to the United States in the Western Hemisphere. This hostility could be exploited by China during a potential conflict. It also seems, from various statements, that this might already be happening. Venezuela could also, irregardless of China, try to exploit the US-Chinese conflict when the US's attention is elsewhere. It might do that in order to secure its own vocal territorial demands against its neighbors. Either of these situations would create a large conventional battlefield on America's doorstep when it needs to be focused on China. The goal, I believe, of the military buildup is to remove the Venezuela piece from the game board now, before war with China even starts. By removing the possibility of a Venezuelan front, the US might also be able to even change China's strategic calculus, potentially de-incentivizing Beijing from even starting the war in the first place. This is causality. The news reports the symptoms. We provide the diagnosis. My name is Sharon Eretz. I have a background in international relations, political science, and sociology. I also am a major in the IDF reserves. As always, this analysis is my own, based on open source material. I am positive many will disagree with this analysis, and I'm sure the comment section will be full of, no, that's not the reason. Here's the real reason why it's happening. But I think it is important to realize that reasons don't have to be mutually exclusive, and there can be many considerations taken into account when undertaking a mission of this magnitude. Now, Washington justifies this military buildup as a necessary response to narco-terrorism. They have designated Venezuelan entities and Maduro himself as narco-terrorists. Using that designation, they have already conducted lethal strikes against drug vessels, which I'm sure all of you are aware of. At the timing of this video, that is all that has happened so far. But it seems to be that this is a buildup to something much larger. The forces that are being brought to bear in the Caribbean Potentially, those that can be used against Venezuela far exceed what is simply needed to stop drug boats. There seems to be a larger, more grander reason for this buildup, and I believe that reason is one of geopolitical maneuver of the highest scale. But first, to show that I'm at least not the only one thinking of matters in this context, I found this articulated by none other than the U.S. Southern Command commander in his February address to Congress, which I attach below in the description. There he says, the United States and China are locked in a fierce strategic competition, pitting democracy against authoritarianism. Over the course of the last decade, the United States has focused predominantly on the Indo-Pacific, while China has taken a global approach. The Latin America and Caribbean region is on the front lines of a decisive and urgent contest to define the future of our world. China is assailing U.S. interests from all directions in all domains, and increasingly in the Caribbean archipelago, a potential offensive island chain. Failure to adequately compete here and now will leave the region under the influence of America's chief authoritarian rivals, which directly threatens the U.S. shift to the Indo-Pacific, jeopardizing freedom of maneuver, access, and influence in our near abroad. This doesn't mean that going after Venezuela because they're narco-terrorists is necessarily false. Both can be true. The narco-terrorist validation could be considered as the valid casus belli for the United States. We first need to understand that nations don't go to war simply because they have a valid reason, a valid casus belli. You go to war also when it serves your interests. It's a cost-benefit analysis. War is expensive, defeat more so. So even if you have all the reasons in the world to go to war with a country, that doesn't mean that that's what you're going to do. To put out an extreme example, just to underline the case, if Andorra had the best casus belli in the world to go to war with France, it's highly likely that it's not going to be in Andorra's interest to pursue that war goal. Instead, they're probably going to let it slide. So when you go to war, you ideally need two things. You need the national interest to go to war, and you need the casus belli to justify pursuing those interests on the international stage. And there's also a lesson here, I think. If a larger country has a good, real interest in going to war with you, perhaps you should refrain from giving them a valid casus belli. Venezuela did kind of the opposite. It's been belligerent against its internal opponents by canceling or rigging elections, and to its external opponents with its saber-rattling and territorial demands. And it also participates in that same drug trade to America, which that has provided the plausible justification for military action by the United States. So that's the casus belli. And what are the interests in going to war with Venezuela, not only ever, but now? So to explain this, I have to put up a map. Here on this map of the world, I put the main countries which are clearly belligerent towards the United States. This isn't exhaustive, and if a major war breaks out, others would likely join, both against the United States and for the United States. But I think the players on this world stage are those who have already clearly chosen the side against the US. First of all, you have China. If the major war against China would take place, then obviously China would be one of the main focuses. And much of the discussion about a potential war has its start being over Taiwan, which they have expressly stated their goal in achieving reunification. Beyond China, though, you have North Korea, who is obviously connected with China, but has its own interests and its own problems. Then you have the burgeoning alliance with Russia, who has its own extension in Belarus. And Russia, of course, is currently fighting in Ukraine. Then you have Iran, which is also part of this Russian-Chinese axis, where money and arms are flowing both ways. To that, I also added Yemen, specifically because of the Houthis and their strategic hold on the Red Sea choke point. And then all the way over here, you have Venezuela. Now, the case could be made to include Colombia or Brazil within this, depending on their current leadership, but I think that's also a stretch. But Venezuela is structurally different. It's a dictatorship and is by far the most belligerent. It's also the only one who has been saber-rattling over territorial claims on its neighbors and threatening military force. I think Venezuela is the only clear participant in the Western Hemisphere who would clearly join China, or at least take advantage of the US being tied down in the Pacific against China, and use that to open up its own front in South America. Maybe you could also include Cuba in this, but I think just simply in terms of the scale of their military and their potential as a clear threat, it's minimal compared to Venezuela. I also think that if you remove Venezuela from the equation, the likelihood of another Latin America or Caribbean country joining against the United States decreases dramatically. Venezuela is the ringleader in this regard. But to understand why military action against Venezuela right now is considered useful, we need to game out how a wider potential war could look like. If you look at this map, most of the antagonists are on the Eurasian continent: Russia, Chinese, Iran. They're all centered in this one area of the globe. If we assume that war with China is an actual possibility, which I think whether it is or isn't, the US administration and military have to believe is a possibility and plan for it being a possibility, how would this war play out? First of all, I don't think Venezuela is the only sort of shaping operation which is occurring or has occurred recently. Perhaps it is the only shaping operation which has been instigated by the US and the West, but the US and the West have been taking advantage of other world events in order to shape the World War III battle space before it has even begun. First, we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, Russia perhaps even viewed this as its own sort of shaping operation. By taking Ukraine, it would shorten its border with Europe and strengthen its position for a global conflict. This is besides the fact that it really seems that Russia kind of wants Ukraine for its own ideological reasons, but from a material standpoint, I don't think this has panned out for them. Even if Russia signs a peace deal now, where they gain quite a bit of territory, they have already spent a vast amount of blood, treasure, and economic slack. Their military stockpiles, which were built up over 50 years of being a superpower, have been largely depleted. While of course they remain a nuclear power, and the lessons they learned there will be invaluable in any fight to come, I think in conventional terms they are way weaker. In any case, I don't think the US is planning that it itself would have to fight Russia, at least in the European theater, during a potential war. Instead, the US is essentially delegating the problem of Russia and the European front to the Europeans. One of the clearest signs of this is the push for NATO to increase its defense spending and to build up its own forces. The US is positioning itself to say to its European allies, when war breaks out, Europe, this is your theater, you take care of this. You take care of Russia there. We have other things to deal with. Second, we have Iran. Now, Iran has just lost a major conflict with Israel. This was a conflict between both itself and its multiple proxies. During this war, they lost Lebanon, Syria, Gaza as allies and forward operating bases, which with they could have struck both US and Israeli interests. What remains is the Houthis in Yemen, their militias in Iraq, and of course, Iran itself, which is much weaker than it was beforehand and has its own set of problems. I think you can also kind of look at the regional security framework, which has been slowly emerging since the war, as a way to counteract Iranian, but not only Iranian, also Chinese and Russian interests in the Middle East. This framework would include Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and even countries further abroad, and obviously Israel. This coalition coming together can counteract those forces both in the Middle East and in Africa. Basically, it seems that America and Trump are trying to do something similar to the Middle East, what it has been doing with Europe, saying this theater is on these allies, you take care of it. We will deal with something else. And what is that something else? China. That seems to be the main focus of where the United States will be looking to spend its military power during a potential war. Of course, it has also tried to build a coalition in the Indo-Pacific to help out with that. But it is clear that the United States wants to put most of its military power in the Indo-Pacific. But when we look at this map again, the outlier is Venezuela. Whose responsibility is Venezuela if and when they join the war? I don't see a South American anti-Venezuelan coalition similar to what we saw in other theaters forming that would be able to invade Caracas. This leaves Venezuela to being an American problem. The only country capable of handling Venezuela during the war would be the United States. But the United States doesn't want to be distracted by Venezuelan front or a larger Latin American front corralled by Venezuela if it is already fighting a war with China. It's going to want all of its capabilities to fight China. The US has a vast army, vast navy, vast air force, but it is still limited. We have seen clear signs of this in the recent years with carrier groups crisscrossing the globe whenever a different hotspot opens up, having to choose where to be because they cannot be everywhere at once. American naval power, air power, and military power is vast, but not infinite. In a war with China, America is going to want all of its military power centered in the Pacific in order to maximize pressure and maximize gains. What this means is that if Venezuela has to be dealt with by America, it is in America's best interest to deal with it now, before World War III ever starts. If it is able to remove Venezuela from the game board, the strategic map for World War III becomes much, much simpler. Without Venezuela, then all across the Atlantic Ocean, you do not have a serious threat. The Atlantic Ocean becomes a NATO sea. Sure, there might be a little bit of problems here or there. Cuba, perhaps, or the east coast of Africa might have some countries who joined the anti-US alliance. But all of those events would be on a much smaller scale. And this can be taken care of by some American and some European spare defense capability. This would allow the US to put almost all of its forces in the Pacific, concentrate there, and with the help of its Pacific allies, take on China. But perhaps most importantly, China is reading the same map. If China sees that it can use Venezuela as a distraction for the US, then it could feel more confident in starting a war with Taiwan and know that the US response will be fractured between two fronts. The war in Taiwan becomes more likely in that case. If, however, the US removes the Venezuelan front from the calculus, it might reduce the chances that China will even start a hot conflict. After we understand all of this, I think we can better expect what will happen in the coming weeks and months with Venezuela. If the goal of the US is to remove Venezuela from the World War III game board, then we can better understand the different types of military political outcomes where that goal can be seen to have been achieved. This would include regime change, but not only regime change. It also takes off the table some of the different agreements which were floated about with Maduro or his regime staying in power. As long as they can potentially open up that front against the United States, I don't think that's on the cards. Now, this doesn't mean that at the end of the day, the United States' strategic calculus will say that it needs to go in all in on a war with Venezuela. This is in its interest, but it doesn't mean that there are not other interests which might override it. But I think this is really one of the main calculuses in why the United States has been putting pressure on Venezuela the way it has. If it can get rid of the Maduro regime without war, then obviously this is in the US's favor. What they want is to take the Venezuela out of the equation. However that occurs, with as little blood and as little treasure, is the advantageous situation. Again, this is causality. The news reports the symptoms, we provide the diagnosis. If you enjoy this analysis, come visit my channel for more. I do a lot of videos on the Middle East, and in the future, I plan to do more videos on topics further afield, such as this one. Until next time, take care.